This is a story about a woman who pretended to be the illegitimate daughter of one of the richest men on the planet. And because people bought into her lies, she was able to dupe a number of men into giving her millions of dollars. But before it was all over, her illegal shenanigans would bring her in contact with the richest man in the world and a United States president. I'll explain. She's the inspiration for the Maud Beaton character on the Gilded Age. The men who gave her money in real life called her Cassie L. Chadwick. Once they realized she stole their money, they probably called her a whole lot of other things that I can't say here. She was a flaming hot mess. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content, and please hit that thumbs up to support this video for free. Thank you. Now, on to why you are here. For those who are watching the Gilded Age, you have seen the very gay Oscar Van Ryn try his best to fall for a woman so that he can carry on the family name. And once he realized that he was not going to be able to take advantage of Gladys Russell for her fortune, he turned his gaze to Maud Beaton, the self-proclaimed illegitimate daughter of one of the richest men in the world, Jay Gould. And it looked like he had a real thing going. He genuinely liked her, even though his preference in the bedroom was man meat. And just when he made up his mind that he wanted to build a future with Maud and propose to her, we learned that she took him for almost every penny his family had. Well, Maud Beaton was based on a real-life woman who did the very same thing to a string of men from the 1880s until the early 1900s. Many of those men knew her as Cassie L. Chadwick, the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, who, in his prime, was the richest man in the world. What could go wrong? Before this lying harlot started calling herself Cassie Chadwick, she was born Elizabeth Bigley in Eastwood, Ontario, Canada, on October 10th, 1857. As a young girl, she was said to have had a mania for fine clothing. She started her life of crime in early adulthood. She was arrested for forgery in Woodstock, Ontario, when she was only 22. And she never did any time for that crime. She made a plea of not guilty by insanity, and it worked. Then, 3 years later, in 1882, the crazy lady got married in Cleveland, Ohio. And she married well. Probably because she lied to her husband about who she was. When she met him, she was posing as an heiress. And it worked. She married a doctor, Dr. Wallace S. Springsteen. And look, I found this ad of his. He had a cure for lady problems. Anyway, her marriage didn't last very long at all. 11 days to be exact. When her husband discovered her criminal background, he threw her little booty out of his house. After her days of being taken care of by the doctor were over, she ran a quickie swindle in Erie, Pennsylvania, under the name Madame La Rose. There, she told her friends that she had a lot of money, but she just couldn't get her hands on it at the time. She asked them to loan her money for an operation for a hemorrhage. Her condition was fake, but they believed her because somehow she managed to extract blood from her gums, and that made her look like whatever the hell she said she was going through. So her friends lent her the money and never saw her again. A couple of years later, under the name Lily Bagley, she moved into a boarding house owned by a Mrs. Hoover. By this time, Cassie was pregnant with someone's child. She wrote back home to Canada telling her mother and sister that she had married a wealthy old man named C.L. Hoover, and he was the father. He was also conveniently dead. At some point, her son, whom she named Emil Hoover, giving him his fake daddy's last name, went to live with her mother and sister, leaving her free to continue faking her existence as an heiress, getting a little more money with each new ruse. Cassie assumed another name, then began telling the world that she was a fortune teller, first as Lydia Scott, then as Madame Lydia de Vere. In that career, if you will, she committed forgery against one of her clients, earning herself a new home, the state penitentiary in Ohio. for a 9.5-year sentence. She was paroled by the governor after serving only 4 years. The governor at that time was William McKinley. Just 5 years after paroling her, he would become the 25th President of the United States. And just 4 years after that, he'd be dead, assassinated while serving as president. And what does a girl do after she gets out of prison? Well, this one married another doctor. She lived for a while under another alias while she was working at a massage parlor. One day, in walks Leroy Chadwick. He got a massage from her, then he wanted her hand in marriage. I don't know if she gave him a happy ending or what, but very shortly after that massage, she was married to Dr. Leroy Chadwick in 1897. His family was well known and well respected, and just the way that Mrs. Astor and New York City had their Astor's 400, the list of the top 400 people in high society who really mattered, other cities all around the country had their own respective 400 lists, and Dr. Chadwick was a member of Cleveland's 400. And he had no clue at all about Cassie's family, friends, or background, which meant that he didn't know about her criminal past. His relatives and friends were not fond of Cassie. To them, she was just some stranger who had appeared out of thin air. They were all in a very tight social circle, and not a lot of outsiders made it in. They thought it was extra strange that not even one of their own knew of Cassie, and they were protective of Dr. Chadwick because he had such a reserved and easygoing personality that they were concerned that someone might try to take advantage of him. And frankly, that was the vibe that they got from Cassie. Well, literally the year that she married Dr. Chadwick, she started going on a fraudulent borrowing spree. She borrowed, and I use that term very loosely, hundreds of thousands of dollars from multiple banks in Cleveland. And just how did this ex-con get her grubby little hands on those bank loans? I mean, her husband's medical practice was doing well, very well in fact, but using his Chadwick name wouldn't have qualified her for those kinds of big money loans. So she just used another name, Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie to be exact. And he just so happened to be the wealthiest man in the world at the time that Cassie was throwing his name around from bank to bank. But still, she was a Chadwick. So how did she get to the path of using the Carnegie name? She told everybody that she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie, and people believed her. The right people believed her. People with money. Bankers. This lying-ass bandit used $5 million in securities, certificates, and promissory notes forged with Andrew Carnegie's name as security. She even had proof of a trust that he had established for her worth just over $10 million. And who would question that? Surely he had the money, so in their eyes, she was good for it. They just gave her the money that she wanted. Think about it. This was the 1890s and very early 1900s when Cassie was running these schemes. Identification systems were either not sophisticated or non-existent. She wouldn't have had a driver's license in her purse to pull out at the bank. And being an illegitimate child wasn't a detail that someone would have been proud to share about themselves in the 1890s. So if she was saying it, it must have been true. And who was going to call out Andrew Carnegie for having a little fun on the side? Nobody was. Clearly, at the very least, he was financially providing for his daughter. So Cassie just showed up, wearing the right clothes, displaying the right mannerisms, pretending to be a rich lady of society whose father wanted to take care of her and was very generous with his money to her, because it was the least that he owed her, since she wasn't allowed to carry his last name or be reared in the same household with his legitimate children. That was how it was laid out. Everyone just took her word at face value and whispered in polite tones about Andrew Carnegie's rich bastard daughter while she blended in with the wealthy of Ohio, Massachusetts, and New York. Well, her time of playing the role of elite socialite was up when, in 1904, a man named H.B. Newton exposed her and ultimately caused her to have to pay for her crimes. When he came forward with his claim against Cassie that she had stolen $190,800 from him, others who had been looking for her were able to file lawsuits against her as well for money that she had taken from them in just the same way, with her quote-unquote daddy's signature as security for the repayment. Cassie's November trial included a lineup of her victims. Here are the names and amounts of the money that some of them wanted to recover. Euclid Avenue Savings and Trust, $38,231.32. American Exchange National Bank, $28,808.25. And Savings Deposit Bank Elyria for $10,000. Including H.B. Newton's claim, she owed over $257,000 that she had stolen, but that was only from the bank presidents who weren't so embarrassed that they went public with how they had been taken. One of those embarrassed men was Charles Beckwith. He was the president of the Citizens National Bank in Oberlin, Ohio, a very tiny bank. And by the time that Cassie encountered him, her audacity and confidence were through the roof, so the $10,000 and $40,000 loans that she had obtained before were chump change. She requested from Mr. Beckwith $340,000 that included $100,000 for a personal loan. By all accounts, he was smitten with her and gave her everything that she asked for. And having those forged promissory notes from Andrew Carnegie didn't exactly hurt her chances of getting approved for a bank loan. But Charles seemed to have a very personal interest in Cassie. Altogether, Cassie had stolen roughly $2 million, jumping from various cities in Ohio to Massachusetts to New York, claiming that she was Andrew Carnegie's secret love child. Those are crazy amounts of money for the 1900s. Adjusted for inflation, that $2 million around the year 1900 would have been like Cassie stealing over $70 million today in 2023. And again, that only includes the amounts that people eventually came forth to claim. Long story short, Cassie was arrested on December 2nd, 1904. And from the looks of it, the cops got to her just in the nick of time. They found her at a room in the Hotel Breslin in Manhattan, apparently ready to make a run out of the state, possibly out of the country. Police discovered $100,000 in cash strapped around her waist. Then there was the trial. All of the details were laid out about so many of her crimes and so much money that she had stolen. But would any of those plaintiffs ever see their money returned? No, because Cassie was spending that money as quickly as she was stealing it. Her purchases were described as many and excessively extravagant, and that's saying a lot considering that she was doing this in the Gilded Age, a time when millionaires were literally painting rooms of their mansions in 24-karat gold. A great deal about Cassie's methods of carrying out her crimes came out in the trial. For instance, after she had gotten off on her first forgery charge, and before she married the doctor in 1882, earlier that same year, she got arrested for borrowing money and not repaying it. She was using yet another name, Alice M. Bastedo, and her collateral for that loan was furniture that belonged to her sister. And after that first doctor kicked her out after just 11 days of marriage, she tried to get $6,000 out of him as some type of lump sum alimony payment. He didn't have to pay her, but for perspective, that's equivalent to about $200,000 today. That's what she wanted in repayment for her 11 days of being a wife to him. In 1883, she faked her own death, writing to some friends that one of her many aliases had just been buried. And in 1887, She committed forgery to obtain an $18,000 loan. That was the crime that earned her the 9.5-year sentence, the one for which McKinley paroled her. Now, this is an interesting addition to that charge. A man named Joe Lamb helped her to commit that crime, and he was charged and tried right along with her. But he was acquitted on the ground that Cassie's hypnotic charm rendered him completely irresponsible. Good Lord, what did this lady have? What kind of charm gave her this kind of hold over people? I want some. I'm trying to do some research to see if she left behind a course or a how-to guide or even a journal for the rest of us ladies. If she did, I'll come back with a part 2 on Miss Cassie, 'cause damn. You see her photos, and none of the men who stole from her even claimed that they found her to be particularly good-looking, but there was this constant theme of men saying that she was hypnotic or they felt like they were under her spell. At any rate, by the time that H.V. Newton's charges brought her to justice, she was still married to the second doctor, Dr. Chadwick. But he had left Cassie in his mansion and went off to live in Europe with his daughter from his first marriage. But when the charges were filed against Cassie, they were filed against Dr. Chadwick too. The thought was that he was her husband, so he had to have known. He had to have been in on it too. She was wrecking men's lives from sea to shining sea. And poor Charles Beckwith, the president of Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, who had loaned her the $340,000 because of her forged Carnegie promissory notes, he had to close his little bank for good. She bankrupted his bank. One source said of Cassie's stealing and spending that, quote, she obtained vast sums of money from unknown sources and squandered vast sums in unparalleled extravagance, end quote. Now, I don't have a detailed list of how and where she spent all of this money, but I did learn that one of her extravagant undertakings with the stolen money was refurnishing her husband's mansion. She spent $200,000 on new decor. That's like you and I spending $7 million today with someone else's money. The nerve. Well, I hope that it was worth it for her, because on March 10th, 1905, Cassie Chadwick was convicted on 7 counts of conspiracy against the government and conspiracy to wreck the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin. Her husband, Dr. Chadwick, had to sail back to the United States from Europe and have his day in court too. But he was exonerated, and rightfully so. He literally had no clue of what his wife had been doing in his mansion while he was in Europe. And as was usual with Cassie, there was some drama in the courtroom after her guilty verdict was announced. Now, by this time in her life, Cassie was losing her hearing. She was partially deaf. So when the clerk stood to read the jury's verdict, guilty on all 7 counts, Cassie Chadwick just stood there in silence, flanked by her lawyer and her son, who was now grown. She hadn't heard a thing. Finally, her attorney, Francis J. Wing, told her, "We have lost, Mrs. Chadwick." She turned beet red, then raised her hand to her head and sank down into her chair. When she was led away to her jail cell, she cried out, "Let me go! Oh my God, let me go! I'm not guilty! I'm not guilty, I tell you! Let me go!" Then she fainted, but they still took her ass to jail. Then there was Cassie's sentencing hearing. And guess who attended? None other than Cassie's fake daddy, Andrew Carnegie himself. She was sentenced to 14 years in prison and fined a mere $70,000. That was nothing compared to all that she had taken from people. And I have to say that it's the money that she took from people, because that was the truth. Yes, the banks were holding it, and sometimes we can get a good laugh when we think about somebody sticking it to the system, sticking it to the banks. You know, the banks were stealing from us. Now they know how we feel. But the fact was, that Cassie stole from every account holder at those banks. This was before the days of Americans' money being secured by the FDIC. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation wasn't established until 1933. Quick note, if you're not an American and you aren't familiar with the FDIC, because I know that we have a lot of people in Ireland and England specifically who watch this channel, the FDIC is a government corporation that insures our bank accounts for up to $250,000 per account. Well, for the sake of Oberlin College, it's a good thing that Andrew Carnegie attended Cassie's sentencing, because when all of the facts came out about Charles Beckwith, the tiny bank president, the court learned that some of the money that he gave to Cassie belonged to Oberlin College. That meant that the money for the school was just gone. $50,000. But Carnegie stepped in to save the day for the college. He gave them triple for their trouble, replacing their lost $50,000 with a $150,000 donation for the construction of a new library. That building still stands today on Oberlin's campus, but now as home to the geology department and other administrative offices. Andrew Carnegie felt horrible for Cassie's victims, and he did help some other ones out as well. She was finally jailed on January 12, 1906, and once the trial was over, it was over for everybody else. Everybody except for the tiny banker, Charles Beckwith, who visited Cassie in prison to tell her, quote, "I am not convinced that you are a fraud, and I look for the time when everything will be straightened out." End quote. He could just not bring himself to believe it, even though he was financially ruined and his bank was gone. Even though he actually had to serve time in jail himself for having been so reckless with the money that belonged to his account holders. And a statement from one person could have saved him from going to jail, and that person was Cassie. Here's what he said about her on his deathbed. Quote, "I could have died happy if she had said one word to clear my name. When I first found that she could not meet her obligations, and I begged her on my knees to save the bank, she laughed in my face. The woman has wrecked my life and the life of thousands whose savings were entrusted to my care." End quote. But he was put out of his misery just a few weeks after visiting Cassie when he died in shame. He was almost as pitiful as a man could be by the end. He was blind, paralyzed, and delirious as he used his last breath to talk about Cassie. His doctor said that the only sense he had left was his sense of hearing, which I think is a little ironic considering that that was the only sense that Cassie didn't have. By the end, she was completely deaf. When the news of his passing reached her, members of the press showed up to her cell, wanting a statement. She was cold and had nothing to say to any of them. She said that she didn't care. But when left alone, in the confidence of a cellmate, Cassie told her that she thought that Beckwith would overcome his illness and get well. She said that the news of his death left her pained beyond expression. But one person did fare well as a result of Cassie's trial. This was a time when drugstore soda fountains were popular in the United States due to the belief that carbonated water was good for health. So there was a belief that sodas helped to cure ailments. Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper were created by doctors, and Pepsi was created by a pharmacist. Well, a Cleveland pharmacist came up with his own drink called Cassie Chadwick Nerve Tonic. Nerve, the one thing that she had plenty of. And if anybody in Cleveland needed some nerve, a sip of his refreshing tonic would hit the spot. It was a bit of a joke, but it did sell very well for him. As for Cassie Chadwick, she didn't get a lot of visitors in prison. Dr. Chadwick didn't visit her at all and barely spoke of her. Months after she was incarcerated, he took his daughter with him to Florida, where he had a brother who owned a furniture store. Then Dr. Chadwick started selling furniture for his brother. And yet again, Cassie did not serve her full sentence. But this time, it wasn't because she got paroled. Remember that she was born on October 10th? Well, she died on her birthday, October 10th, 1907, at the age of 50, serving less than 2 years of her 14-year sentence. Her cause of death, according to the prison doctor, was a bad heart. Well, no one who had a seat at her trial would have argued with that diagnosis. If you watched The Gilded Age, let me know if you'd like to see the Maud Beaton storyline end in a similar fashion. Cassie Chadwick was by no means the only woman of this era who was in and out of prison. There was another lady who was pardoned by a president, or maybe I should call her a lady of the night who was pardoned by a president. Her name was Lulu White, and she ran a whorehouse during the Gilded Age, and she was always in trouble with the law. I published a video about her that you can see here. I'll leave a link to it in the description box. My sources for this story are Belmont Chronicle Archives 1890, Case Western Reserve University at case.edu, Chicago Tribune Archives 1904 and 1936, the Daily News Archives 2009, the Knoxville Sentinel Archives 1904, Kentucky Post and Times Star Archives 1904, the Spokesman Review Archives 1904, the Washington Post Archives 1904, the Philadelphia Inquirer Archives 1904, and El Reno Weekly Globe Archives 1905. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.